What is it, girl? Smokey, stay.
They called it Rubbish Land, a cursed hole in the Tennessee mountains no one would touch for $1. They laughed when Jax Harlan signed the papers, laughed harder when they saw his dog. Jax is a combat veteran, 12 years in uniform. His wife emptied the house while he was deployed. His family stopped answering. He sleeps in his truck with the last thing he has in this world, a wounded German shepherd named Smokey who bled beside him on foreign soil. 40 acres. One collapsing cabin. One sealed mine shaft. Everyone in Briar Hollow mocked him. Then the storm came, and Smokey started to dig. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you are watching from today. The pale gray light of a late winter dawn pushed slowly across the high ridges of the eastern Tennessee mountains, sliding like cold water down through the bare black hardwoods and the skeletal laurel, and it found Jax Harlan exactly where it had found him every morning for the last 163 consecutive days, sitting upright in the driver's seat of his 1994 Chevrolet pickup truck with the engine off and both of his scarred hands resting on the dead steering wheel. The truck cab smelled of cold metal, stale black coffee, wet canvas, and the heavy mineral dust that never quite washed out of a working man's clothes after a winter spent in the mountains. His breath hung in the air in slow gray clouds. The temperature outside had dropped to 23 degrees sometime in the middle of the night, and he had felt it come. He had felt the metal of the cab begin to tick and settle as the heat went out of it, and he had felt the cold press itself against the window glass like a hand, and he had not turned the engine back on to run the heater, because the engine was the last thing between him and walking, and the diesel was the last money in his pocket, and a man who had slept in colder places than this could sleep in 23 degrees without complaint. Beside him, curled into a thick, compact shape on the passenger seat, with her heavy body wrapped almost entirely inside his own worn surplus field jacket, lay the German shepherd. Smokey. 7 years old, 84 pounds, a double coat of black and tan and silver gray that had grown out long and full through the winter months. She was awake. She had been awake since the first thin line of light. Her amber eyes were open and fixed straight ahead through the windshield, and her ears moved in small, quiet adjustments at every sound the hollow offered. A red-tailed hawk called once from somewhere high over the ridge. Smokey's right ear tilted forward and back. A tree branch somewhere to the north cracked under the weight of a late snow still clinging to it, and her head lifted by a quarter inch and settled again. Jax watched her do this, the way he had watched her do this for 7 years, and something very small and very tired inside his chest eased by a fraction. The land in front of the truck was his now. 40 acres, signed on a wet Tuesday afternoon in the county courthouse in Briar Hollow with an ink pen that was low on ink and had skipped over the date. $8,400 cash, counted twice by a tired clerk who would not quite meet his eyes, the last of what Jax had managed to preserve from a savings account that had once been much larger and had been, through no action of his own, cut down and cut down and cut down again until this was all that remained. $8,400 for 40 acres of what the locals called rubbish land, one collapsing log cabin with the roof stove in on the north side, one sealed mine shaft, timbered closed in the year 1947, when the last attempt at silver production had given out and the Hayes family had walked away from the ground forever. No road access beyond the rutted track that ran down from the county road. No running water that had not frozen solid in the line. No power, no neighbors closer than 3/4 of a mile. He had looked at it once in the fall, on a clear cold day with Smokey at his heel, and he had looked at the ridge line and the way the creek ran along the south edge, and the way the old cabin stood square to the rising sun, and he had known, in the way a soldier knows an occupiable position, that a man and a dog could survive on this ground. He got out of the truck slowly, opening the door against its protest. The cold came at him all at once. He pulled the surplus field jacket off of Smokey and shouldered it on, and felt the warmth of her body still inside the collar. Smokey rose, stretched, planted her paws against the vinyl seat, and jumped down beside him without a sound. He closed the truck door. The world was silent. Somewhere to the east, half a mile off, a single rifle shot broke the silence. A deer hunter, legal season, Second morning of the late antlerless. The report bounced off the ridges once, twice, flattened out. Jax's hand moved entirely on its own, to rest on the thick, warm fur behind Smokey's right shoulder. He held it there. He counted the breaths that moved her ribs under his palm, the way he had been counting them for 7 years. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The counting was not thinking. The counting was the thing underneath thinking. It was the thing he did so. He did not have to do the other thing, the one where his body forgot it was in Tennessee, and remembered it was somewhere very different, where a rifle report was not a deer hunter, where the next sound after the report was always the one he could not bear to hear again. Smokey leaned her weight into his leg. Deliberate, solid, present, the counting passed. His breath came back to a rhythm he could use. He let his hand slide away from her shoulder. "All right, girl," he said quietly, and his voice was rough from disuse, from cold, from the kind of silence that stacked up in a man who had almost no one left to talk to. "Let's see what we've got." He walked the property line first, the way he walked everything, clockwise, from a known point. Smokey worked the ground ahead of him in loose, efficient arcs, nose low, head up between passes, ears constantly cataloging the hollow. She had worked this pattern in places far more dangerous than a Tennessee ridge. The discipline had not left her. It never would. The cabin was worse than he remembered. The north roof was stove in where a big hemlock had come down on it in some storm a decade or more back. And the hemlock was still there, half grown over with honeysuckle and briar, and the interior of the cabin smelled of damp rot and old wood smoke and the faint sharp tang of mouse. The hearth was solid. The walls were 3 of 4. The foundation stones were level and true. A man with 2 working hands, a saw, a claw hammer, and 3 months could make the cabin sound again. Jax had 2 working hands. He came around the west side of the cabin and stopped. The mine entrance sat 40 paces up the slope, set into the raw face of the limestone like a black eye cut into the mountain. The old timber closure was still there. The boards blackened with moss and the bolts rusted through, and it leaned inward in a way that suggested the whole barrier could be pulled free with a pickaxe and a length of chain. A rusted iron sign wired to the timbers read "Hazard," and below it, "Do not enter," in letters that had faded to pink. A second sign below that, hand-painted on a scrap of plywood in much more recent years, read "Hayes Curse" in black marker, with a crude grinning skull beside the words. Jax looked at the skull for a long time. Smokey had walked up the slope ahead of him and was sitting now, square on her haunches, 6 feet in front of the closed mine entrance. Her ears were forward, her tail was curled neatly around her paws. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the timber closure. She was looking at it the way she had looked, once, at a buried culvert in a road outside a village whose name he could no longer pronounce. And what had been buried in that culvert had nearly killed 3 men, and Smokey had sat in front of it in this exact posture. And no one afterward had ever doubted her again. Jax watched her for a long time. He did not speak. He did not move. Finally, he said, very softly, "We'll see." He walked back down the slope. In the truck, he took out the only 3 possessions he owned that were not strictly necessary for survival. He laid them on the hood in a row: a small scuffed leather folio, a plain brown paper envelope with the Veterans Affairs seal in the top left corner, and a cheap prepaid cell phone that had not received a call from a family member in 471 days. The leather folio held 2 things. The first was his dog tags, bent slightly at one corner from a piece of shrapnel that had cut him along the collarbone on a Tuesday in October, and the second was a single photograph, 4 inches by 6, of a woman with dark hair laughing on a pier somewhere in Florida. The photograph was folded in half, so that only the background showed sky and water, and he had not unfolded it in 2 years, and he had not thrown it away either, because throwing it away felt like admitting something he was not ready, yet, to admit out loud. His hand had shut the folio before his eyes could drift to the folded crease. The VA envelope held a letter dated 3 weeks back, responding to an appeal he had filed 7 months ago. The appeal had been denied. The letter was written in a polite, impersonal register, and it used the words "reviewed" and "considered" and "unable to substantiate," and it did not use the words "thank you for your service," because the VA had long since stopped bothering with such ornaments in a letter whose purpose was to say no. The phone did not ring, because there was no one in his contact list who called him anymore. His mother had not called in almost 2 years, his younger brother had not called in almost 3. His wife, his ex-wife, now had not called since the morning he had returned from his final deployment to find the house on Chestnut Street sold, the furniture in a storage unit that had been 3 months unpaid, a manila envelope containing a copy of signed divorce papers on the kitchen counter of the rental she had moved into, and a letter in her handwriting that said, in language that had clearly been shaped by her attorney and then softened into something that looked like her own voice, that she was sorry but she was not the person she had been when he left, and she could not be the person he needed anymore, and she had done what was necessary for her own well-being, all of it legal, all of it within her rights. Everything had been legal. That was the part that still woke him up at 2 in the morning. The part where a woman he had trusted with his entire life had emptied it from him without ever doing anything he could point to as wrong. His family had not taken his side in the quiet way families so often refuse to take sides. His mother had said she loved him, but she had said it in the voice of a woman choosing not to choose. His brother had said the situation was complicated. His sister had said she hoped he was getting help. No one had asked him where he was sleeping. He had stopped asking. He gathered up the 3 objects, put them back inside the truck, and shut the door. That day he and Smokey walked the property again, this time with the roll of orange flagging tape he had bought at the Briar Hollow feed store, and he flagged the corners as best he could find them. The feed store had not been a pleasant stop. The man behind the counter, a heavy-set fellow in a cap that read Briar Hollow Co-op, had looked over the top of his reading glasses and said, "You the fellow bought the Hayes place?" Jax had said, "Yes, sir." The man had looked at him a long moment, then he had said, quietly, so it would not quite carry to the 2 women at the coffee pot by the door, "Hope you didn't pay too much for it." The 2 women had laughed. Jax had paid for the flagging tape and left without answering. At the gas station on the way back, the pump had not read his card. The clerk inside, a young man no more than 20, had scanned the card with visible reluctance, glanced at Smokey sitting in the truck cab, and said, "You can't have that dog in here, sir." Jax had not been bringing Smokey inside. He had been standing in the doorway. He had stepped back outside without answering and had waited for the pump to release. At the small diner beside the Hollow's only traffic light, he had sat at the counter with Smokey tied to a post outside in the cold, and the waitress, a thin, tired woman with tight gray curls, had brought his coffee and his eggs and had set the ticket face down on the counter before he had finished eating. When he had laid out the money and said thank you, she had said, without meeting his eyes, "You enjoy that rubbish land of yours, honey." He had walked out of the diner and untied Smokey and driven back out to his 40 acres, and he had not returned to town in 6 days. Now he stood in the clearing in front of the half-stove cabin, with the orange flagging tape coiled in his hand and his breath hanging in the air, and Smokey at his heel, and he looked up at the ridge line against a pale gray sky, and he looked at the mine closure with its hand-painted skull, and he thought for the first time in a long time, a single clear thought. They don't know what they're looking at. He did not know what he was looking at either. Not yet, but he thought maybe Smokey did. The 5th morning on the land, he was splitting stove wood in the side yard when Smokey lifted her head from where she lay in a patch of weak sunlight near the cabin wall and rose slowly to her feet. Her ears came forward, her tail did not move. Her body turned 30 degrees toward the rutted track that led down from the county road, and she held that position with the particular stillness she reserved for arrivals that had not yet resolved themselves into friend or threat. Jax set the maul down in the block and stood, wiping his forearm across his forehead. His field jacket was off, laid across the porch rail, and he was in a gray thermal shirt that was dark at the collar and between the shoulder blades from the morning's work. He had not heard anything yet. He trusted what Smokey had heard. He heard it 30 seconds later, a slow measured step on gravel, one person, lightweight, not a hurried step, not a furtive step, a tired, careful step that paused and resumed and paused again. He did not move from the woodpile. He let his hand drop close to his hip where a hunting knife rode in a belt sheath, and he waited. Around the curve of the track, walking slowly with a small cardboard box balanced on one hip and a thermos held against her chest, came a woman he had never seen before in his life. She was small, 70, maybe older, although the eastern Tennessee mountains put age on a woman's face in a way that was hard to read. Her hair was silver, pulled back under a green wool cap. She wore a dark brown quilted coat that had been mended at both cuffs with thread that did not quite match, and a pair of work boots that had been men's once and had been relaced for smaller feet. Her cheeks were red with the cold. She was breathing a little hard from the climb. She stopped about 15 paces from the edge of the clearing and set the cardboard box down carefully on a flat section of gravel, and she straightened up and looked directly at Jax, and she did not try to smile, and she did not try to pretend she wasn't a stranger walking unannounced onto a man's property. "Good morning, sir," she said. Her voice was thin, clear, unashamed. "My name is Eleanor Hayes Briggs. I live about a mile down the road on the old Briggs place. I've been a neighbor of this land my whole life, and I brought you cornbread and coffee because it seems to me that a man who has moved onto a piece of ground in winter has earned at least that much from the people who live nearest him." Jax looked at her for a long moment. Smokey had moved to stand beside his left leg. Her ears were still forward, but her tail, Jax noticed, had shifted. It was hanging now at its neutral position. Her body had eased by a fraction. She was reading Eleanor Hayes Briggs, and she was finding nothing that required a higher alert. "Ma'am," Jack said with a small nod. "Come up on in." He walked to meet her, picked up the cardboard box from the gravel, and gestured her toward the porch. She followed him, watching Smokey as they walked but making no attempt to pet her or approach her. A woman who knew dogs, he thought. A woman who knew to wait. On the porch, he set the cardboard box down on the wide flat rail and lifted the top flap inside. Wrapped in a clean red and white checkered dish towel was a pan of cornbread still warm. Beside it, in a battered stainless thermos with a dented lid, sat coffee whose scent reached him through the cold air and opened something in his chest he had not known was closed. "Ma'am," he said, "I appreciate this more than I can quickly say." "Then don't try," Eleanor said. She was watching him with a clear, patient gaze. "My husband, God rest him, always told me a cold man and a hot biscuit never need to make conversation right away. Eat." He poured himself a cup of coffee. He did not ask her to sit. He pulled the one chair on the porch toward her slightly, and she sat down with a small, slow sigh that said her knees had not enjoyed the walk up. He broke off a piece of cornbread, ate half of it in 2 bites, and gave the other half to Smokey, who took it from his open palm with the delicate, deliberate mouth of a dog who had been taught, under fire, that every bite mattered. Eleanor watched this. "That's a military dog," she said quietly. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am." "She yours before or after?" "Both. She served 2 deployments with me, and I wouldn't sign my discharge papers until they signed hers." Eleanor nodded once, slowly, as if this confirmed a thing she had already decided. "My Benton served in Vietnam," she said. 1966-67, came home in 68 without the leg he went with. He died 5 summers ago, next August, of a cancer the VA argued about for 11 years. He was a good man. He used to say, you could tell a whole life about a soldier by watching his dog eat. Jax looked out at the ridge. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm sorry for your loss." "And I," Eleanor said, "for yours." There was nothing in her voice that suggested she knew any specific thing about his loss. There was only the knowledge, which she seemed to carry as a matter of course, that a man sleeping in a truck on cursed land in a Tennessee winter had lost something. She sipped her coffee. "I didn't just come up to bring cornbread, son." "No, ma'am," Jack said. "I didn't think you had." She smiled for the first time, a small, tired smile with more sadness than warmth in it. "My family used to own this land," she said. "My great-great-grandfather Silas Hayes bought it in 1851 with money he made running a small forge down where the creek meets the river. It stayed in our family until 1931, when my grandfather lost it to the bank during the Depression. It's been owned by 5 different outfits since then. You're the first person in 41 years to put a human foot on it for longer than a weekend." Jax listened. "There's a story that goes with this ground," Eleanor said. "You'll have heard parts of it already from those fools in town. About the curse, about my great-great-grandfather. I want you to hear it from me, since it's my family they're laughing at." She set the thermos down on the rail. She folded her thin, arthritic hands in her lap. She looked out past the clearing at the mine entrance on the slope. Silas Hayes died in November of 1864. He was a captain in a Confederate supply unit. He was not a Confederate by choice. East Tennessee was Unionist country, son, as Unionist as any ground in the South, and my family was Unionist. And Silas was pressed into service because he was educated and they needed men who could read a ledger. He didn't want to wear that gray coat. He wore it because they would have hanged him if he hadn't, and then they would have come for his brothers. Her voice had not changed. It was still thin, clear, measured. But the way she spoke these sentences, Jax understood that she had spoken them many times, in her own head, and never to anyone willing to hear them. The story the town tells, she said, is that Silas tried to steal Confederate gold and got killed for it by his own officers, and his ghost walks the mine because a coward's ghost can't rest. That's the story my grandfather heard, and my father heard, and my husband heard. And I've heard it in the feed store, and the post office, and the diner my whole life. I've been asked by grown men in Briar Hollow, right to my face, if I was ashamed to be a Hayes. She sipped her coffee again. I'm not, she said, but I've had to say so out loud for 60 years. Jack said nothing. The family searched that mine, Eleanor went on, for 3 generations. My grandfather searched it as a boy. My father searched it as a young man. My husband went in there with a carbide lamp and a short shovel one summer in 1975, because he thought he could give me an answer before we had children. He didn't find anything. Nobody did. Eventually we stopped looking, and the bank took the land, and the story became a joke instead of a shame. Which is, I suppose, a kind of mercy. She looked at Jax. I didn't come up here to ask you to dig in there, son. I came up here because you need to know, before somebody in town tells you wrong, that whoever Silas Hayes was, he was not a coward, and he was not a thief. He was my grandfather's grandfather, and he died in that gray coat trying to do some right thing, and nobody alive today knows what that thing was. Jax looked at her a long time. Ma'am, he said, I believe you. Eleanor's eyes went a little bright. She blinked it away. She did not thank him. She took a long breath. There's one more thing, she said. I didn't come up here for a friendly visit either. I came up here because I'm in trouble, and because I think you're going to be in trouble soon too, and I thought you ought to know who your neighbor is before it starts. She reached into the pocket of her quilted coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, creased many times, stained along one edge, with what looked like coffee. She set it on the porch rail. My husband took out a small loan against our house in 1996 to help cover his treatment when the VA wouldn't. That loan got sold. It got sold again. It got sold 4 times. About 18 months ago it was bought by a corporation called Lang Properties LLC. Payments became, I suppose the word is calibrated, to terms I could not meet on a widow's Social Security. 3 weeks ago I got this notice, foreclosure. I have as of today. 23 days before a sheriff's deputy is legally permitted to come to my door with a paper that puts me out of the house my husband's father built with his own hands in 1947. Jax looked at the folded paper. Curtis Lang, Eleanor said, is the man's name. He owns Lang Properties, which is a development corporation out of Knoxville. He's been buying up this whole valley for 3 years. He's already taken the Crawford place, the 2 Miller tracts, and the old Haskins farm. He's bought 11 properties in Briar Hollow. He's wanted this land, the Hayes land, your land now, for a long time. He's going to come up this track inside of a week, and he's going to offer you more than you paid. And when you say no, he's going to make it clear to you that he will take the land another way. Her mouth worked for a second. She steadied it. I'm not asking you for anything, son. I'm telling you what's coming. A man ought to know what's coming. That's what Benton would have said. That's why I walked up the hill. She stood up slowly, with her hand on the porch rail for balance, and nodded once to Jax and once to Smokey, and she turned back toward the track. Smokey stood up. She did not bark. She did not growl. She walked very calmly to a position about 6 feet from Eleanor and looked up at her with her ancient amber eyes, and she wagged her heavy tail one time low and slow against the porch floor. In the measured, deliberate rhythm she used to mark, in her own grammar, a person she had decided was under her protection. Eleanor looked down at the dog. She looked at Jax. She did not cry. She did not speak. She reached out one thin-veined hand and rested it for a single second on Smokey's broad forehead, and she nodded at Jax, and she walked off down the track with her empty thermos against her chest. Jax stood on the porch and watched her go. Smokey sat beside him, facing down the track, until Eleanor had disappeared around the curve and the sound of her careful boots on the gravel had faded into the silence of the hollow. Then Smokey turned. She walked, without any prompting, 40 paces up the slope to the mine closure. She sat in the exact spot she had sat in the first morning, square on her haunches, tail curled around her paws, amber eyes fixed on the rotted timber, waiting. Jax looked up at the slope a long time. He walked into the cabin, he came out with the pickaxe. Curtis Lang came up the rutted track at 11 minutes past 10 on the morning of the 7th day, 3 vehicles strong, exactly the way Eleanor Hayes Briggs had said he would. Jax heard them long before he saw them. He had been on the cabin roof, pulling rotted cedar shakes off the south pitch in the weak winter sun, and the sound of 3 engines climbing in second gear carried up the hollow like a column of armor on a dirt road. He set the claw hammer on the roof peak, climbed down the leaning ladder, walked once around the cabin to put the wood stack between him and the expected approach, and took a position in the clearing with his field jacket buttoned, his hands loose and empty at his sides, and Smokey seated at heel on his left. The lead vehicle was a shining black Ford F-250 with a crew cab and dealer plates that had been swapped onto it less than 6 months ago. Behind it came a white extended cab Chevy with a surveyor's transit in a rack behind the rear window and a young man in a reflective vest at the wheel. Behind that came a silver sedan that was too clean and too low to have any legitimate business on a rutted mountain track, and it came up the ruts slowly, cautiously, like a lawyer on a disputed property. The 3 vehicles stopped in a loose triangle at the edge of the clearing. The driver's door of the Ford opened, and Curtis Lang stepped out. He was tall, 52 years old, with the gym-built bulk of a man who trained for appearance rather than work. He wore a sheep-lined suede jacket that had cost more than Jax had paid for the 40 acres, clean-pressed jeans, and tan work boots that had never actually worked. His hair was silver at the temples, darker on top, cut in a way that suggested a weekly appointment in a city. His teeth were white. His smile was calibrated. "Mr. Harlan," Curtis Lang said, walking forward with one hand extended and the other tucked into the pocket of the sheep-lined coat. "I've been meaning to come up and introduce myself. I know you've been settling in." Jax did not take the extended hand. He said, "Mr. Lang?" Curtis Lang held the hand out for 1 beat longer than was comfortable, then let it drop to his side with a small, practiced, unoffended laugh. "I see my reputation precedes me," he said. "Let me save you some time. I'm Curtis Lang. I own Lang Properties. I develop land in this part of the state, and I've been looking at this hollow for about 3 years. I like what I see. I want to talk to you about your 40 acres. Jax said nothing. Smokey sat perfectly still at his left heel. Her ears were forward, her tail was motionless. Her amber eyes were fixed on Curtis Lang with the particular settled attention of a working dog assessing a threat that had not yet revealed its shape. She did not growl. She did not shift. She simply looked at him, and Lang, who was a man who made his living reading rooms, found himself, almost against his will, looking down at the dog. "That's a handsome animal," he said. "Yes, sir," Jax said. "Mr. Harlan, I'll cut to it. I'd like to buy this property from you. I know what you paid. I'd like to offer you $15,000 cash. That's almost double. That's a better return in 7 days than most investors see in 10 years. Jax looked past Lang's shoulder at the ridge. "Not for sale," he said. Curtis Lang laughed, the small, practiced laugh. "Mr. Harlan, with respect, we are just getting started. Let me explain why this is a good offer. This is cursed ground. I'm sure you've heard the stories in town, the Hayes curse, the mine. 3 families have gone broke on this land in 1 century. You didn't buy a homestead, you bought a reputation. I'm the only man in the valley willing to take it off your hands at a premium, because I'm the only man with a plan that doesn't depend on the ground being anything but what it is, which is 40 acres of south-facing slope with a view of the Smokies, which, if properly cleared and platted, will support 8 vacation cabins at $300,000 apiece." Jax said nothing. "Let me make it simpler," Curtis Lang said. $20,000. I can have a check in your hand this afternoon." "Not for sale," Jax said. Lang's smile shifted, a very small shift, invisible to anyone who had not been trained to watch a man's face for precisely that kind of shift. "25, he said. "No, sir. 27,500. That is my absolute top number. I cannot go any higher and make the math work, Mr. Harlan. I am being extraordinarily fair." Jax looked at him then, directly for the first time. He said, without heat, without hurry, without the slightest elevation in his voice, Mr. Lung, the land is not for sale. Not today. Not for 27,500. Not for 100,000. I've heard your offer. I've declined it. I'm going to ask you now to take your truck and your surveyor and your lawyer back down the track and off my property. Curtis Lang looked at Jax for a long moment. Something in the man's face reorganized itself. The calibrated smile went away. What replaced it was not anger. Anger was a hot thing. What replaced the smile was cold and administrative, the face of a man sliding a document into a file and making a note in the margin that said, "Apply pressure." "Mr. Harlan," Curtis Lang said, "I understand. Believe me, I understand a man's home is his home. But I want you to think about a few things, because I think when you think about them clearly, you're going to want to call me." He held up one finger. "The county is considering a zoning change in this watershed. It's coming up at the commission in February. My firm has been consulted on it. If the change goes through, 40 acres of unimproved ridgeland without road access loses about 60% of its speculative value overnight." He held up a second finger. "There's an environmental survey scheduled for this entire hollow in the spring. The state has concerns about abandoned mine drainage into the creek. Your mine shaft is going to be inspected, if remediation is required, and it almost always is on a property with a 19th century silver working. The cost of compliance falls on the current owner. That's you. Those costs typically run between $40,000 and $120,000. He held up a third finger. "And finally, Mr. Harlan, I just want you to know that in a town like Briar Hollow, relationships matter. The people who sell you your gas, your groceries, your feed, your lumber, your hardware, they are all people I have business with. I do not say this as a threat. I say this as a fact of small-town life. A man without a certain kind of standing in a certain kind of town can find the simplest errands becoming remarkably difficult." He lowered the three fingers. "Think about it. My card is on your porch rail. I hope to hear from you by Friday." He walked back to his Ford without waiting for a reply. The surveyor in the Chevy had already turned the vehicle around. The lawyer in the silver sedan had never opened his door. The three vehicles went back down the track in reverse order, and the sound of their engines faded into the hollow, and after a long silence the hawk on the ridge called once more, and then the morning was quiet. Jack stood in the clearing for a full minute without moving. Smokey rose, slowly, and leaned her weight against his left leg. He put his hand on her shoulder. "I read you loud and clear, girl," he said softly. He walked to the porch, picked up the card Lang had left on the rail, looked at it once, folded it in half, and slid it into the breast pocket of his field jacket. He did not throw it away. A man in a fight kept his enemy's card. That afternoon he drove into Briar Hollow with Smokey in the passenger seat and stopped at Eleanor Hayes Briggs's small clapboard house on the county road. She was on her porch when he pulled in, wrapped in the quilted coat, a thin mug of tea between her hands. He got out without shutting the truck door behind him. "Ma'am," he said, "I'd like to take a look at that paperwork if you'll have me." Eleanor looked at him a long moment. Her eyes were very tired. "Come on in, son," she said. Her house was a two-bedroom with a front room and a kitchen, and it was the kind of house a woman of her generation kept spotless out of habit and pride, even when the roof was not quite tight anymore. There was a wood stove going in the front room. A framed flag, folded in the regulation triangle, sat on a small table beside a photograph of a young man in an army dress uniform with a serious face and a crooked smile. Corporal Benton Briggs, 1966. His eyes were the same shape as Eleanor's eyes. She brought out a brown accordion folder tied with a string and laid it on the kitchen table and untied it with fingers that trembled only slightly. "Everything I have is in here," she said. "The original loan, the 4 sales, the notices, the foreclosure paper. Benton always kept copies of everything, said it was the only thing the Army ever taught him about civilian life." Jack sat down at the table. Smokey lay down on the linoleum beside his chair, her chin on her paws, her eyes open, her ears relaxed. He read the entire folder. He read it the way he read a briefing, slowly, start to finish, no skipping. He took a small notepad from his breast pocket and wrote down dates, numbers, entity names. He did not rush. He did not ask questions as he went. Eleanor sat across the table with her mug of tea and did not interrupt. She had lived long enough to know when a man was working. It took him 42 minutes. When he was done, he closed the folder and looked up at her. "Ma'am," he said, "you have 23 days. Yes. The loan is structured wrong." She blinked. "I beg your pardon, son." The original loan in 1996 was written with a right of first refusal in your name for any subsequent sale of the note. That clause is there. It's on page 3 of the original document. It's a standard consumer protection in Tennessee in that period. It should have been formally extinguished at each of the 4 subsequent sales. It wasn't. None of the 4 transfers I'm looking at includes a valid notification of the right of first refusal to you personally in your own name as the surviving spouse. 3 of them don't mention the clause at all. The 4th, the sale to Lang Properties, references a waiver, but the waiver is signed by a person who does not appear to be you. Eleanor stared at him. "I never signed a waiver, son." "No, ma'am, I don't believe you did. And the signature on file is not yours. I've compared it against your signature on the receipt for your electric bill on top of the refrigerator." Her mouth opened. She closed it. "What does that mean, son?" "It means, ma'am, that the sale of your note to Lang Properties may be defective. It means that any foreclosure proceeding that rests on that sale is on unstable ground. It means practically that if you file a motion in Chancery Court tomorrow morning requesting an injunction pending investigation of the signature, you will very likely get at least 30 days of delay and possibly more. It means, Mrs. Briggs, that 23 days becomes at least 53, and possibly much longer. And it means Curtis Lang cannot put a sheriff's deputy on your porch at the end of the month." Eleanor Hayes Briggs put her thin hand flat on the table to steady herself. "I don't have a lawyer," she whispered. "I can't afford a lawyer." "You don't need one today," Jack said. "You need a clerk of chancery in Knox County and $30 and a notarized affidavit that the signature on the waiver is not your signature. I can drive you to Knox County tomorrow." She looked at him. "Why?" The question was not accusatory. It was not suspicious. It was the exhausted question of a woman who had been walked past by too many people for too long. Jax did not answer right away. He looked at the framed flag, at the photograph of Corporal Briggs, at the silver in Eleanor Hayes Briggs's hair. He said, "Ma'am, a man in a gray coat in 1864 tried to do a right thing. From what you told me, I don't know what it was. I don't know if he pulled it off, but he tried, and nobody in his line has had anybody in their corner for 162 years. That's long enough." Eleanor's eyes were wet. She did not let the tears fall. She said, "My Benton would have liked you, son," Jack said. "Ma'am, I believe I would have liked him too." When he drove back up the track to his 40 acres, the sun was low behind the ridges, and the light on the limestone face of the mountain had gone from pale gray to the soft, burnt gold that came for 15 minutes at the end of a clear winter day. Smokey was quiet in the passenger seat. Her head was up. Her eyes were on the road. At the top of the track, she jumped down from the cab on her own, and without any signal from him, walked up the slope to the mine closure, and she sat once more in front of the rotted timbers in her perfect square posture, and her amber eyes stayed fixed on the dark closed mouth of the mountain. Jax took the pickaxe off the porch and walked up to join her. He worked until the cold took his hands. He pulled 2 boards loose. A narrow black opening appeared at the top of the closure. Cold, dry air came out of it, smelling of stone and iron and the stilled silence of 162 years. Smokey stood up, walked to the opening, and put her nose in it for the count of 3. Then she sat back down, and Jax, looking at the narrow black gap he had opened in the side of a Tennessee mountain, understood with a clarity he had not possessed that morning, that whatever was coming next was no longer his to decide. The first blast came at 7:43 on a Thursday morning. Jax was in the cabin. He was on his knees in front of the stone hearth, fitting the last section of stovepipe he had scavenged from the collapsed lean-to, and Smokey was lying in a patch of early sun on the rough plank floor beside him, half dozing, one ear folded back under her chin in the way she slept when she was genuinely at ease. The blast was small. The blast was legal. The blast was also, in terms of what it did to the inside of Jax Harlan, not small. It came from the adjacent property to the west, a narrow parcel that Curtis Lang had taken off a retired schoolteacher 2 years ago and had been holding in a shell corporation called Briar Ridge Holdings. A 2-man crew in a yellow truck had pulled up the county road at dawn. Lang had sent them. Lange had not sent them to do any actual demolition. Lange had sent them to do a thing that was legal under Tennessee code, a sequence of small controlled survey shots along the property line, each no larger than a single stick of commercial dynamite in a pre-drilled hole intended, the paperwork said, to assess subsurface stability for future cabin foundations. The paperwork was perfect. The paperwork also happened to place 5 consecutive small shots within 400 yards of Jack's Harlan's cabin on the windward side at intervals that matched, to within a second, the cyclic timing of a foreign mortar team's ranging sequence. The first shot hit the air, and then the ground, and then Jack's body, in that order, and his body was on the plank floor before his mind had finished the thought that is a dynamite charge. His left hand had hooked into the floorboards, his right hand had come across his chest for a rifle that was not there. His face was against the rough pine with his head turned to the right and his left ear to the floor, listening for the second ranging shot that would tell him which quadrant the enemy was correcting into. The second shot came. It was closer. A cold, wet wind shifted across the clearing. Cordite, even diluted over 400 yards through the thin winter air. The smell of cordite reached the cabin and went into Jax's head like a key into a lock he had been trying, for 4 years, to weld shut. The cabin floor was not the cabin floor. The cabin floor was the packed earthen floor of a mud compound in the Helmand Valley, in a month he could not quite name. And his hand was not on pine but on a canvas tourniquet that was already soaked through, and the tourniquet was wrapped around a leg that belonged to a man he was not permitted now to name, and the man's blood was hot through the canvas against his palm, and somewhere above him someone was yelling in English, and someone else was yelling in a language he had learned well enough to know that what the second person was yelling was, "Get the dog, get the dog, get the dog." He could not remember whose leg. He could never remember whose leg. He could hear, in the foreign compound and the Tennessee cabin both at once, a sharp high German shepherd bark that was not the training bark, and was not the alert bark, and was the specific bark Smokey had for incoming, down now, and he heard it in 2 places simultaneously, and he could not tell, in the collapsed time, whether it was memory or a sound in the room. It was a sound in the room. Smokey was standing over him. She was not barking anymore. She had barked once, hard, to get his body down, because his body had already been going down but had been halfway through it when the second shot came. Now she was standing across his back, with her front legs braced on either side of his ribcage, and her chest against his shoulder blades, and her warm, heavy head pressed down hard against the side of his face, her muzzle along his jaw, her breath in his ear at the steady 28 per minute rhythm of a calm working dog. She was not letting him get up. She was also not letting him go away. The third ranging shot came, closer still. Smokey did not flinch. Her weight on his back did not shift. Her breath in his ear did not change. Jax's hands were shaking. His face against the pine was wet. He was making, in the back of his throat, a sound he had not made in front of another human being in 12 years. A low, broken sound that was not a word, and was not a cry, and was simply the sound a man made when the inside of him was coming apart along an old scar. He counted her breaths. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The counting was not thinking. The counting was the thing underneath thinking. 7, 8, 9. His own breath began, slowly, to find her rhythm. 10, 11, 12. The fourth shot came. It was muffled. He heard it in Tennessee. He heard it only in Tennessee. 13, 14, 15. The fifth shot came. He heard it. He knew what it was. He knew where he was. The cabin came back into the cabin. The pine under his face was pine. Smokey's weight on his back was the weight of 84 pounds of German shepherd who had not moved a muscle for 4.5 minutes. 16, 17, 18. The blasts stopped. The silence came back into the hollow. A single crow called once from a high branch. Smokey stood over him for another full minute before she shifted her weight off. She did not step away. She lay down alongside him on the pine floor and pressed the length of her body against his side and put her chin across the back of his neck and waited. He lay with her for a long time. When he finally sat up, his hands would not quite stop shaking, and he held them between his knees, and he rested his forehead on top of them, and he did not move for another 15 minutes. Smokey stayed beside him. Her breathing stayed slow. At some point, he got up. He walked outside the cabin into the cold, and he stood in the middle of the clearing, and he looked up at the ridge that separated his property from Briar Ridge Holdings, and he saw the thin pale trail of dust still drifting up from the fifth hole, and he understood, with a clarity that was entirely free of heat, exactly what Curtis Lang had done and exactly why. A man like Lange never broke a law. A man like Long used the law like a tool. A man like Lang had someone inside the county tell him, almost certainly, that Jax Harlan was a combat veteran. A man like Lang knew that a combat veteran in a Tennessee cabin on a winter morning with 5 controlled charges on the windward side would, for a time, be a man who could not split firewood or answer a telephone or sign a Chancery Court affidavit. Lang had not made an offer today. Lange had made a demonstration. Jax stood in the clearing for a long time. He went back inside the cabin. He did not light a fire. He sat on the plank floor with his back against the cold stone of the hearth and Smokey's head in his lap, and he stared at the open doorway and the thin winter light coming through it, and he thought, for the first time since he had signed the papers in the Briar Hollow courthouse, a thought that had the shape of surrender. You cannot help that woman. The thought came in his own voice. That was the cruel part. It did not come in the voice of Curtis Lang, or the voice of the Briar Hollow feed store, or the voice of a VA examiner who had written, unable to substantiate. It came in his own voice, calm and reasonable and level, the voice he had used to brief junior sergeants on untenable positions. You are a broken man. You cannot even stand up in your own cabin when the wind shifts. You are not going to help a 72-year-old widow out of a foreclosure. You are going to fail her. You are going to fail her publicly, in the middle of a small town, and she is going to lose her house anyway, and whatever small bright thing she saw in you is going to go dark, and you are going to be for her one more man who came close and could not do it. Be honest with her. Walk away now. Save her the watching. The thought had the weight of a good briefing. Night came. He had not eaten. Smokey had not eaten either. He got up and poured dry kibble into her steel bowl, and she looked at it for a long time before she ate. She was reading him. He could feel her reading him. He sat at the small camp table he had set under the window, and he took out the canvas duffel that held everything he owned, and he began, slowly, methodically, to pack it. Clothes, folded square, shaving kit rolled, the leather folio with the dog tags and the folded photograph, the VA envelope, the cheap prepaid phone, Smokey's water bowl, Smokey's food bowl, the half sack of kibble, the canvas lead he had not used in 3 years. He closed the canvas duffel and lifted it to the floor beside the door. He turned out the lantern. He lay down on his bedroll in front of the cold hearth. He did not sleep. Around 4 in the morning he sat up, pulled on his boots, shouldered the duffel, and walked to the door. Smokey was sitting in front of the door. She was not lying down. She was sitting, square, her amber eyes on him in the weak blue light of a quarter moon through the cracked window. Her tail was not moving, her ears were not forward and alert. Her ears were at rest. She was not reading a threat, she was not reading a wound. She was looking at him the way a sergeant looked at a soldier who had decided, quietly, that he was going to fall out of the march, and she was not going to say a single thing about it, and she was also not going to move. He stood at the door with the duffel on his shoulder. "Girl," he said. His voice was not steady. "Girl, let me go." She did not move. "I can't do it, Smokey." She did not move. "I can't." She did not move. He stood there, with the duffel on his shoulder, in a dark cabin in a Tennessee hollow at 4 in the morning, and he looked at a retired military working dog who had bled beside him on a foreign floor and who had refused at this hour to let him walk out a door, and after a very long time he lowered the duffel to the pine floor and he sat down beside her. And he put his face in the heavy fur of her neck, and he did not cry, because he had not cried in a very long time, and he was not going to start now. But he made, again, the low broken sound he had made on the floor that morning, and Smokey held perfectly still and let him make it. When the gray came up in the east, he was still on the floor with his hand on her shoulder. He stood up, he carried the duffel back to the corner, he unpacked it, item by item, folded square, rolled, returned to its place. He lit the stove. He made coffee. At 7, Eleanor Hayes Briggs came slowly up the rutted track with a tin pail in one hand and she was carrying the pail in a way he could tell, even from the porch, was not easy on her shoulder. She was not wearing her green wool cap, her silver hair was covered with a black scarf. She was walking, he realized, the way a person walked after lying awake all night. She stopped at the edge of the clearing. She said, "I brought you biscuits, and I brought you apple butter. Because I heard the blasting yesterday morning, and my Benton used to have a hard time for 3 days after a thing like that, and I thought you might too." He stood on the porch and looked at her. He said, "Ma'am, I appreciate it." She climbed the porch slowly. She set the pail on the rail. She did not look at his face. She looked out at the ridge. "I'm not going to ask you any questions, son," she said. "My Benton hated when a person asked questions, but I want to say one thing, and then I'll go." "Yes, ma'am. My Benton had bad nights too," she said. "For 40 years he had bad nights. Most of those nights I did not know how to help him. I learned after a while that you do not help a man like that by asking him to be better. You help a man like that by being there in the morning, with biscuits, so he knows morning came." She patted the rail once, very lightly with her thin hand. "Morning came, son," she said. "That's all I came up here to say. Morning came." She walked back down the track without another word. Jack stood on the porch with a pail of biscuits in front of him, and he watched her go, and Smokey sat at his left heel and watched with him, and at some point he realized, with a slow, quiet astonishment, that his hands were not shaking anymore. He also realized, in the same slow, quiet way, that a storm had come up during the night. Not a visible storm, a forecast. He had not listened to the weather radio in 3 days. Now, standing on the porch with apple butter and biscuits and a dog at his heel, he heard, carried up the hollow from Eleanor's house a mile down the road, the faint, thin voice of a National Weather Service broadcast coming out of her kitchen window. "Flash flood warning, East Tennessee. Through Sunday evening." He looked up at the sky. The sky was low. The sky was gray. The sky was the exact color of the back of a bruise. He set the pail of biscuits on the porch rail. He said quietly to Smokey, "Girl, we have work to do." The rain began a little after 1 in the afternoon, and it did not stop. It began as a slow, steady, cold rain that hissed in the bare branches of the hardwoods and darkened the gray stone of the cabin foundation, and for the first hour it looked, from the porch, like any ordinary winter rain in eastern Tennessee. The sort of rain a man could work in if he put a hood up and kept moving. Jax moved in it. He carried armloads of split stove wood from the open yard into the lean-to he had patched the week before. He tightened the new tarp he had stretched across the north pitch of the cabin roof. He pulled the truck up closer to the porch so that the bed sat under the overhang. He did this with Smokey at his heel the entire time, silent, soaked through to her undercoat within the first 30 minutes, utterly unbothered by the weather, her amber eyes tracking his hands. By 2:30, the rain had thickened into something that was no longer ordinary. It came in sheets the way it came in the tropics, vertical walls of water that turned the clearing into a field of small brown running rivers, and the sound on the tarp over the cabin roof became a continuous sustained roar that swallowed the sound of his own boots in the mud. The thin voice of the National Weather Service on the small wind-up radio he had set on the porch rail began to repeat its warnings on a loop. Doppler indicated training cells over the entire Briar Hollow watershed. 9 inches expected by midnight. Flash flooding already reported on the Little Pigeon River. Residents in low-lying areas advised to evacuate to higher ground immediately. Eleanor Hayes Briggs's house was a low-lying area. He did not think. He picked up the key to the Chevy. He opened the passenger door. Smokey jumped up into the cab without being called. He slammed the door, climbed in his own side, and put the truck down the rutted track in 4-wheel drive low, and the ruts had already become small creeks, and the creeks had already become brown streams running hard enough to rock the truck from the side as he descended. The county road was worse. The ditches were full. The asphalt in 2 places was under 4 inches of running water that crossed from the upslope side to the downslope side in a fan of debris and leaves, and the broken branches of pines. He drove through it in second gear with both hands on the wheel and his eyes forward, and Smokey on the bench seat beside him, upright, steady, her body braced with the easy controlled balance of a working dog riding in a moving vehicle. Eleanor's small clapboard house sat at the low point of the county road, where the road crossed Briggs Branch, a narrow creek that ran behind the property in a shallow channel lined with river birch. The creek was not in its channel when Jax arrived. The creek was in the backyard. The creek was in the garden. The creek was lapping up against the back porch steps, and while he watched, a half-submerged plastic fuel can came around the corner of the house in the current and disappeared down the driveway toward the road. He left the truck running. He took the porch steps 2 at a time. The front door was unlocked. He opened it without knocking. Eleanor was in the kitchen. She was standing very still in the middle of the linoleum, with her green wool cap on her head and her quilted coat over her arm. She was holding, pressed hard against her chest with both thin, arthritic hands, a triangular glass case with a neatly folded flag inside it, and on top of the glass case, resting on her forearm, was a faded color photograph in a cheap wooden frame of a young man in a dress uniform. She looked up when he came through the door. She did not speak. He said, "Ma'am, we're leaving now." She nodded once. "What do you need first?" She looked around the kitchen. She looked at the framed photograph of Benton. She looked at the flag case. She looked at the old faded quilt on the back of the rocking chair by the wood stove, and she said, almost in a whisper, "My mother's quilt. She sewed it in 1943. I would like the quilt." He took the quilt off the rocking chair, folded it in half, and hung it over his left shoulder. He took the flag case gently from her hands. He said, "What else, ma'am?" "My medications. On the counter. In the blue basket." He got the blue basket. "My purse. On the hook by the door." He got the purse. "The wooden box on the top of the bedroom dresser. It has my Benton's papers." He walked down the short hallway through 3 inches of water that had already come up through the floorboards from underneath the house. The bedroom was dry. He took the wooden box, a cheap pine box with a brass latch, and he carried it under his arm. "Ma'am," he said, back in the kitchen. "Anything else?" She looked around her kitchen. Her mouth worked. She said, "No, son. Just me." He walked her out to the truck with his left arm around her shoulders, and the flag case in his right hand, and the wooden box under his right arm, and the quilt over his left shoulder, and the purse in his left hand, and the blue basket hooked over his left wrist. And Smokey came down from the cab to walk on Eleanor's other side, pressed against Eleanor's hip, bracing her steps, because the porch was already slick and the wooden steps were already rocking under the current at their base. He put Eleanor in the passenger seat with the quilt across her lap, and the flag case on top of the quilt, and the wooden box on her knees, and the basket and purse at her feet. He put Smokey on the bench seat beside her. He drove back up the county road, with the water rising behind them. At the top of the track, where his own ruts began, the water had cut a channel 6 inches deep through the lowest section. He took the truck through it in low range. The front axle skipped once, caught and pulled. They made the clearing. The cabin was not going to hold. He saw that in a single glance. The tarp had pulled loose at the north corner, and water was already coming through the stove and section of roof, and the floor inside would be 1/2 an inch deep within the hour. The porch was solid. The stone foundation was solid. But the roof was not going to be a roof for a storm of this size, and the stovepipe, which was fitted but not yet sealed, would backdrip into the hearth and put the stove out by midnight. He looked up the slope. The mine closure was still there. The narrow black gap he had opened at the top, the place where Smokey had put her nose for the count of 3, was a dark mouth on the face of the mountain. He thought, in one clear line, the mine is rock. He carried Eleanor up the slope himself. He carried her with one arm under her knees and one arm across her back, and Smokey walked 3 paces ahead of them up the wet slope, picking the footing, pausing at the steep places, glancing back to check his balance. The way she had led wounded men up goat trails in a country where there were no roads. At the mine closure, he set Eleanor on the flat stone lip in front of the timbers. He went down the slope twice more, fast. First trip, the flag case, the wooden box, the quilt, the blue basket, the purse. Second trip, a kerosene lantern, a battery lantern, 2 wool army blankets, the small camp stove, a gallon of water, the coffee pot, a tin of coffee, a small bag of kibble, and a canvas tarp folded under his arm. He took the pickaxe off the porch last. He worked on the timber closure for 6 minutes with Eleanor sitting on the stone lip wrapped in her mother's quilt and Smokey pressed against her left side. He pulled 3 more rotted boards loose. The narrow gap became a low doorway a man could stoop through. He went in first with the kerosene lantern held high and smoky at his heel. The mine was dry. That was the thing he registered first, before the dimensions of the space, before the quality of the stone, before anything else. The air inside the mouth of the shaft was dry and cold, and smelled of stone and rust and something very faintly mineral that was neither unpleasant nor alive. The shaft went back into the mountain for perhaps 30 feet at the same width as the mouth, then opened into a rough chamber about the size of the cabin's front room, with a ceiling of bedded limestone that was 10 feet high at the center. Old timber supports, blackened with age, lined the walls. A rusted ore cart sat overturned in the far corner. The floor was rough but level. He came back out. He carried Eleanor into the chamber and set her on the canvas tarp folded on the floor near the south wall. He brought in the quilt and the blankets, the stove, the water, the lanterns. He sealed the lower half of the doorway with 2 of the boards he had pulled loose, leaving the upper half open for air. The rain became a wind that became a scream. Outside the mouth of the shaft, the world was a column of water and broken branches, and the sustained white noise of a watershed giving up all at once. Inside the stone chamber, 60 feet from the mouth, the sound of the storm was reduced to a distant low rumble like a freight train passing on a track 3 miles away. He lit the kerosene lantern and set it on the overturned ore cart. The yellow light filled the chamber and painted the limestone walls a soft, warm gold. He lit the camp stove. He put the coffee pot on it. Eleanor sat wrapped in her mother's quilt, with the flag case across her lap and Benton's wooden box beside her hip. Her eyes were large and tired. Her silver hair had come loose under the wool cap. She looked at the stone walls, at the yellow lantern light, at the warm coffee pot, at Smokey lying now across her feet with her heavy chin on her paws. She said, "Son, I am alive because of you." Jack said, "Ma'am." "You're alive because of that dog." Eleanor looked down at Smokey. She put her thin hand on the top of Smokey's broad head. "Yes," she said, "I expect I am." Hours passed. They drank coffee. They ate biscuits from the pail. Eleanor, at some point, in the deep part of the night, when the storm outside was still a freight train, but the yellow lantern light had made the chamber feel like a kind of parlor, began, without being asked, to talk. She talked about her grandfather, who had been born in 1872 on the land above them, and who had lost this ground to the bank in the winter of 1931, and who had cried on a porch the night the papers were signed. She talked about her father, who had worked 3 jobs and saved for 20 years to try to buy the land back, and who had died in 1961 without saving enough. She talked about Benton, who had gone into this mine exactly once, in the summer of 1975, with a carbide lamp and a short shovel, and who had come back out at dusk, empty-handed, and had sat on their porch for 2 hours without speaking. She talked about Silas, about the stories her grandmother told about Silas's ghost, about the grinning skull painted on the plywood sign at the entrance of this mine, about 60 years of being asked in the feed store whether she was ashamed to be a Hayes. She talked, and she kept her hand on Smokey's head, and Smokey breathed slowly under her palm, and outside the mouth of the shaft the storm pressed against the mountain, and the mountain did not move. At some point late, Jax could not quite place when Smokey lifted her head off her paws. She sat up. Her ears came forward. She looked, not at the doorway, not at the storm, but at the deep black throat of the shaft, where it went further back into the mountain beyond the lantern's light. Eleanor stopped talking. Smokey stood up slowly. She walked 3 steps into the dark. She stopped. She came back. She sat down. She stood up. She walked 3 steps into the dark again, a little further this time. She stopped. She came back. Eleanor said, "Is she wanting to go out, son?" "No, ma'am." "What is she doing?" Jax did not answer right away. He was watching her the way he had watched her once, in front of a buried culvert, in a country whose name he no longer spoke aloud. Her ears were at the exact forward angle. Her tail was motionless. Her amber eyes were fixed at a single point he could not yet see. Her breathing had dropped by 2 per minute. He knew the posture. He had seen it 11 times in his life. Every one of those 11 times there had been something buried under the ground in front of her that the human beings in the room did not know was there. He said very quietly, "Ma'am, I need you to stay right here with the lantern. I need to follow her." Eleanor looked at him. She did not ask why. She said, "Go on, son." He picked up the battery lantern, he clicked it on. He walked slowly to where Smokey was sitting at the edge of the lantern light. He knelt beside her. He put his hand very lightly on her right shoulder. "Show me, girl," he said. Smokey got up and walked into the dark. He followed. The shaft narrowed past the chamber and ran back into the mountain on a slight downward grade. The walls were rougher here, picked by hand rather than blasted, showing the marks of 19th century tools. Rusted iron rails for the ore cart ran down the center of the floor under a skim of gray dust. The air was dry and still and cold. Smokey walked ahead of him in the steady, measured pace of a working dog tracking. Not pulling, not rushing, stopping once to sniff the base of a timber support and then moving on. 40 feet in, 60, 100. At 140 feet, by his count, Smokey stopped. She turned 90 degrees to her left and sat. Square, tail still, ears forward, eyes fixed. He raised the battery lantern. The wall in front of her was not the wall around it. The wall around it was rough limestone, natural, picked by hand. The wall in front of her was brick, red brick, a section approximately 4 feet wide and 5 feet tall, mortared into a rough alcove in the limestone. Mortared dark with age but still holding. The brick itself weathered with a fine powder of 162 years of still mine air but otherwise intact. No one had any reason to brick a wall in a silver mine. No one except a man who wanted a thing to stay behind it. Smokey pawed once at the base of the brick. A single short, deliberate paw. Jax knelt beside her. "Good girl," he whispered. "Good girl, good girl." He did not call Eleanor yet. He needed to know what was behind the brick before Eleanor saw it. He took the small pry bar from the loop on his belt. He worked the tip into the mortar at the top left corner. The mortar gave faster than he had expected. The first brick came loose in his hand. He set it on the floor beside him. The second brick came loose. The third. By the 10th brick he could see, in the narrow black gap he had opened, the curved black shape of something that was not stone. He lifted the battery lantern higher. Behind the brick was a chamber. The chamber was small, perhaps 4 feet deep and 5 feet wide, a natural pocket in the limestone that had been enlarged by hand and then sealed off with the brick. Inside the chamber was an iron-bound wooden chest, its leather straps rotted through, its lid closed. Beside the chest, stacked in 2 neat rows against the back wall of the pocket, were 8 smaller wooden crates, each about the size of an ammunition box, their tops marked in faded black paint, with stenciled letters he could not read from this angle. On top of the iron-bound chest, set carefully in the exact center of the lid, was a small polished wooden box, about the size of a family Bible, its wood darkened but not warped, its brass latch intact. He stopped. He did not open anything. He stood up. He put his hand on Smokey's shoulder. He said, "Stay." She stayed. He walked back down the shaft to the chamber where Eleanor Hayes Briggs was sitting, wrapped in her mother's quilt by the yellow light of a kerosene lantern, and he knelt in front of her. And he took both of her thin hands in both of his scarred hands, and he said, very quietly, "Ma'am, I need you to come with me." She looked at his face. She did not ask. She let him help her to her feet. He walked her slowly down the shaft with her hand in his elbow and Smokey ahead of them leading the footing, and he stopped her at the brick wall, and he raised the battery lantern, and he let her see. Eleanor Hayes Briggs stood in front of a red brick wall in a Tennessee mine shaft at 3 in the morning during the worst flood of her lifetime, and she looked at the narrow gap he had opened, and she looked at the iron-bound chest and the 8 smaller crates and the small wooden box sitting in the exact center of the chest lid, and her knees went out from under her. He caught her. He eased her down to sitting on the floor of the shaft with her back against the cold stone of the opposite wall, and he knelt in front of her and kept his hand on her shoulder, and she did not cry. She did not make a sound. She sat and she stared at the narrow gap in the brick, and her thin lips moved in a shape that had no voice behind it. Smokey walked around him and sat down beside Eleanor on her left side, and she pressed her warm 84-pound body against Eleanor's ribs gently, the exact pressure a working dog used on a human being going into shock. Jax reached into the gap in the brick. He lifted the small polished wooden box off the top of the iron-bound chest. He brought it out. He set it on his thigh. He opened the brass latch. He lifted the lid. Inside was a thin oilcloth bundle. Beside the bundle was a single photograph on a sheet of tin, silvered at the edges, the image still clear after 162 years of dry mine air. The photograph showed a young man in a Confederate gray coat, standing stiffly in front of a painted studio backdrop, one hand tucked into the breast of the coat. The hand, tucked inside the coat, was pressing against a small metal object that was not quite hidden by the fabric. The object, if you looked carefully, caught the studio light. It was pinned to the inside of the lining. It was not Confederate, it was a small Union cavalry medal. Eleanor's thin hand reached out for the photograph. She took it. She brought it up to within 3 inches of her eyes in the lantern light. She looked at the face. A single sound came out of her, a small broken exhale that was almost a word and was not quite. She said, "That is him." Her voice was a thread. "That is my grandfather's grandfather. I have seen that face 3 times in my life, in 3 different family photographs. That is Silas Hayes." Her eyes fixed on the hidden medal inside the gray coat. She looked at Jax. She said, "He is wearing a Union cross under his coat." Jax said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Everyone in Briar Hollow said he was a coward. They said he was a Confederate captain who tried to steal from his own side and got shot for it. Every man in my line carried that shame." "Yes, ma'am." "But he was a Union man." "Yes, ma'am." "Under the coat." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at the photograph. She looked at the iron-bound chest. She looked at Jax. She said, and it was not a whisper, it was not a cry, it was the clearest sentence she had spoken in any of the hours he had known her. "My family was never ashamed." Then her shoulders finally shook. She did not weep loud. She wept the way a woman who had held 60 years of a small accumulated shame finally lets that shame leave her body, silently, in small controlled waves, with her thin hand pressed against her mouth and her other thin hand holding a photograph on a sheet of tin so carefully that her fingers did not touch the image. Smokey pressed herself harder against Eleanor's side. Jax did not move. He did not speak. He knelt in front of an old woman crying in a stone shaft 140 feet inside a Tennessee mountain, with a retired military working dog braced against her ribs and a kerosene lantern yellow behind them and a storm pressing against the world beyond the brick, and he understood, finally, with the same clarity with which he had understood Curtis Lang's demonstration, what Smokey had been sitting in front of for 8 days. She had not been sitting in front of gold. She had been sitting in front of a man's name. They did not open the iron-bound chest that night. Jax understood, without speaking it out loud, that the iron-bound chest was not the thing that mattered most in the sealed chamber, and that opening it now, in the yellow kerosene light of a mine shaft at 3 in the morning, with a 72-year-old widow trembling against the cold stone, would be a violation of an order he had not yet named to himself, but that Smokey had already named by sitting in front of the brick wall for a week without barking. What mattered first was the oilcloth bundle inside the small wooden box. He carried Eleanor back to the first chamber. He settled her again on the canvas tarp with her mother's quilt around her shoulders and the flag case across her lap and her hand still gripping the tin photograph as if it were a thing that might be taken away from her in her sleep. He brought the small wooden box with him. He set it beside her on the tarp. He put more kerosene in the lantern. He sat down cross-legged on the floor in front of her. Smokey lay down between them, facing the dark shaft, her chin on her paws. "Ma'am," Jax said, "the oilcloth bundle is a journal, or I miss my guess." "I know it is, son. Do you want me to read it, or do you want to read it?" She looked at him. "Son," she said, "I would like you to read it to me, if you don't mind. I don't trust my hands tonight." He nodded. He lifted the oilcloth bundle out of the wooden box. The oilcloth was stiff with age and dry, not brittle. He unwrapped it in his lap. 2 turns, 3 turns, 4. Inside the oilcloth was a second wrapping thinner of waxed brown paper. Inside the waxed paper was a single leather-bound book. Small, the size of a man's palm, the leather dark with age, the front cover blind stamped with initials SWH and the year 1862. He opened the cover. The paper inside was yellowed but intact. The ink, in a careful schoolmaster's hand, had faded from black to the deep brown of strong tea. The writing was small, tight, legible. The first page was dated March the 4th, 1862, and began with a line Jax read out loud in the warm yellow light of the lantern, while Eleanor Hayes Briggs pressed her thin fingers against the tin photograph and listened. He read, "I begin this book because I cannot, in the house of my own mother, speak the things I think, nor can I write them where another hand may find them. I am 29 years of age. I am, as of the 12th of January past, a commissioned captain in the Confederate States Army, by the assignment of men who cared nothing for my opinion of the war and cared only that I could read a ledger. I am not a Confederate. I have never been a Confederate. I am a son of East Tennessee, a Unionist by raising and by conviction, and I wear this gray coat because the alternative offered to me and to my brothers was the end of a rope. May the God who made me judge me gently for the cloth I wear and see the heart beneath." Eleanor Hayes Briggs closed her eyes. Jax read on. He read for 3 hours. He did not read every page. He read the pages that told what Silas Hayes had done between the summer of 1862 and the last entry, which was dated the 11th of November, 1864, 6 days before Silas Hayes was killed. He read of Silas's assignment to a supply unit out of Chattanooga. He read of Silas's discovery in the spring of 1863 that his unit was systematically shorting the ration issue to Confederate enlisted men while the ledger recorded full issue, and that the difference in both rations and specie was being quietly redirected into the private accounts of a colonel whose name Silas wrote in the book only as the officer whose signature appears in the second ledger. He read of Silas's growing correspondence with 2 black teamsters attached to his unit, men whose names Silas wrote plainly in the journal, Abraham Green and Peter Coates, freedmen from Nashville, who had been pressed into service as drivers and who had quickly understood, as Silas had, that the officer in charge of their section was stealing from every man in the column. He read of the 3 of them, Silas and Abraham and Peter, meeting in secret in a hayloft outside Dalton, Georgia, in August of 1863, and agreeing that if the opportunity ever came to redirect a piece of the stolen flow toward a better end, they would do it together. He read of the opportunity coming in October of 1864. He read of a shipment of specie, $17,000 in gold coin, captured by Confederate forces from a Union paymaster's detachment outside Knoxville, and entered falsely on the colonel's private ledger as 4,000. He read of Silas being detailed, with Abraham and Peter, to escort the shipment back toward Chattanooga on a 3-wagon convoy through East Tennessee. He read of the 3 of them deciding, in the cold last week of October, that they would turn the wagons north at the ford of the Little Pigeon and drive the gold into the Hayes family mine shaft, which Silas had known since boyhood, and which lay 6 miles off the wagon route along a cart track that only a local man could have followed. He read of them doing it. He read of them burying the gold in the chamber at 140 feet, of Silas's own hands laying the brick he had made in his mother's forge as a boy, of Peter Coates and Abraham Green stacking the crates against the limestone wall, of Silas writing, with a steady hand, the final entry of that action in the journal Jax now held. He read, "We have done this thing tonight, November 11th, 1864, the 3 of us together, and we have agreed, by the God of each of our understandings, that this gold is not mine, and it is not theirs, and it is not the Confederacy's, and it is not any longer the private purse of any thieving officer. It belongs to the work of rebuilding, when the work of rebuilding becomes possible, and it belongs to the families of this valley who will have, by the end of this war, lost more than they know how to count. I have written in the pages that follow the names of those families, white and black, Unionist and otherwise, whom I would wish to see helped, if God grants me the breath to help them, and if He does not, then whomever finds this book after me, I charge with the task of choosing mercifully in my place. I have placed particular trust in the families of Abraham Green and of Peter Coates, whose courage has been greater than my own, and whose descendants, wherever they may be, shall be first among those remembered. I shall return, if I live, to recover this in the peace. If I do not live, then may this book be found by a kinder hand." Jack stopped reading. The chamber was silent, except for the low, distant rumble of the storm. Eleanor Hayes Briggs sat with the tin photograph in her lap, and her hands folded over it, and tears ran down her lined cheeks without sound, and she did not wipe them away. She said, "Go on, son." Jax turned the page. The following 4 pages were a list in Silas Hayes's hand. 47 names of families in the Briar Hollow Valley and the 3 adjoining hollows. some with notes on what they had lost, some with notes on what they had done. The list was neither alphabetical nor ranked. It was, Jax understood, the order in which the three men had remembered the names. The 11th name on the list was Briggs. Beside it, in Silas's careful hand, was written B. Briggs of the Upper Road, Unionist, driven from his small farm in '63 by Confederate conscription raiders, lost the elder son at Franklin, the widow and children in hiding as of this date in the mountains above Greenville. A good family. Eleanor's hand came up to her mouth. Son. Yes, ma'am. That's my Benton's great-grandfather. Yes, ma'am. I believe so. My Benton's great-grandfather is on that list. Yes, ma'am. She made a small sound that was not a word. She pressed her thin hand harder against her mouth. Smoky lifted her head from her paws and looked at Eleanor, and then lowered her chin back down. Silas Hayes, Eleanor said, and her voice was slow, careful, amazed. Wrote my Benton's family into a book of names in 1864, Silas Hayes, my grandfather's grandfather, before any Briggs and any Hayes had ever married. Before any of my people knew any of my husband's people, he put them on a list of families to be helped. Yes, ma'am. And 115 years later, his great-great-granddaughter married one of them. Jax did not say anything. There was nothing to say. Eleanor Hayes Briggs lowered her hand from her mouth. She looked at the tin photograph. She said very softly, to a man in a gray coat who had been dead for 162 years, "We married one of them, grandfather. We did not know we married one of them." The storm outside continued far off. They slept for a few hours, or at least Eleanor slept, wrapped in her mother's quilt on the canvas tarp with Smoky pressed against her back. Jax sat with the journal closed on his lap and the kerosene lantern low and watched the shaft. The rain stopped a little after dawn. When the first thin gray light began to come through the upper gap in the boarded doorway, Jax went outside. The world was changed. The clearing was a field of mud and broken branches. The track down was a ravine. Trees he had known by their bark were down. The tarp on the cabin roof was gone entirely, and the north pitch had finally given way, and the inside of the cabin he could see from the porch was under 3 inches of brown water and sticks. The truck, parked high against the porch overhang, had come through with only mud on its doors. The lean-to had held. The stove wood under it was dry. Down in the valley, Eleanor's small clapboard house was gone. He could see it from the ridge, or rather he could see where it had been. The roof had come off and gone down the creek. The walls had fallen outward. Only the brick chimney remained, standing up out of a field of mud and debris like the last tooth in an old jaw. He stood on the porch and looked at it a long time. At 9:37, by the cheap wristwatch he still wore, Curtis Lang came up the rutted track on foot, in hip waders, with a clipboard under his arm and a man in a reflective vest 20 feet behind him. Lange stopped at the edge of the clearing when he saw Jax on the porch. He raised a hand in a small, composed, neighborly wave. "Mr. Harlan," he called across the mud. "Glad to see you made it through. I've been checking on my properties in the hollow. Quite a storm." Jax stepped down off the porch. Smoky came with him. She walked at his left heel in the mud in the exact steady pace she had walked in market streets on 3 continents. Jax stopped about 15 feet from Curtis Lang. "Mr. Lange, I saw Mrs. Briggs's place down there. Terrible, terrible, total loss, I'd say, between you and me at her age. She's probably better off in some kind of managed setting now. I'd like to help her find one. My firm has relationships with 2 good facilities in Knoxville. I can have somebody call her today." Jax looked at him. "Mr. Lang," he said, "I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm going to say, because I am going to say it once." Something in the quality of Jax's voice made Curtis Lang take half a step backward before he caught himself. Jax reached into the breast pocket of his field jacket and took out a folded manila envelope. He held it, but he did not yet hand it over. "Last Thursday morning, Jax said you had a crew perform 5 controlled survey shots on the Briar Ridge parcel on the windward side of my cabin, legal under Tennessee Code, not under federal statute, Mr. Lang, when performed with the intent of inducing psychiatric distress in a disabled veteran in order to coerce the sale of real property. That is a civil rights violation. That is also a matter of interest to the United States Department of Justice." Lange's face did not change. His eyes changed. "You have," Jax said, acquired 11 properties in this hollow over the last 3 years. I spent Monday afternoon at the Knox County Chancery Clerk's office, which is open to any citizen. I pulled the original loan documents on 7 of those 11. In 4 of the 7, the right of first refusal held by the original borrower was neither properly extinguished nor properly waived. One of those 4 involved a signature that does not match any document signed by Mrs. Eleanor Hayes Briggs in the last 40 years. That is forgery under Tennessee Code Annotated 39:14. That is also wire fraud, Mr. Lang, because the loan packages were transmitted interstate. That is federal. Lang's mouth opened slightly. He closed it. In this envelope, Jack said, are copies. The originals are with a retired Judge Advocate General's Corps attorney in Nashville who has agreed to represent Mrs. Briggs on a pro bono basis and who has agreed, at my request, to take any additional named plaintiffs from this valley who wish to join. I have spoken with 3 of the 7 borrowers as of yesterday morning before the storm. All 3 have expressed interest. He held the envelope out. Langhe did not take it. Jack set it on a dry stump between them. This is how this goes, Mr. Lang. You will tear up the foreclosure notice on Mrs. Briggs's property before noon today. You will assign her loan back to her, paid in full, as damages. You will release the other 3 defective loans. You will withdraw any offer on any remaining property in this valley. You will not contact any resident of Briar Hollow again, and you will not ever send a crew back onto the Briar Ridge parcel. If any of those conditions fails, the envelope goes to Nashville by end of business. After that, Mr. Lang, you and I will not be speaking at all. You will be speaking to an assistant United States attorney. Curtis Lang looked at him for a long time. He did not speak. He picked up the envelope from the stump. He turned around. He walked carefully, in his hip waders, back down the rutted track through the mud, and his man in the reflective vest followed him, and neither of them looked back. By 4 in the afternoon, a courier in a pickup truck had delivered to Eleanor Hayes Briggs, in care of Mr. Jax Harlan, 40 acres, Briar Hollow, 3 documents, a release of lien, a full assignment of her loan to her name with a paid stamp, a signed withdrawal of all claims by Lange Properties LLC against the Briggs property. The courier did not say a word. He handed Jax the envelope and drove back down the track. Jax brought the documents to Eleanor, who was sitting wrapped in her mother's quilt on the porch of his half-drowned cabin, with Smokey lying across her feet and the flag case beside her and a small polished wooden box on her lap. She read the 3 documents. She read them twice. She set them down on her knees. She looked up at Jax. She did not say thank you, she said, and her voice was steady. Son, sit down. Jax sat down on the porch step in front of her. Eleanor Hayes Briggs reached out with one thin hand and put it on the side of his bearded face, and she held it there for a long, slow count, and her eyes looked into his eyes, and she did not smile, and she did not cry, and she said, "My husband would say that you are a soldier still." Jax looked at her. "Ma'am," he said, "I believe I needed someone to say that to me." "Yes," Eleanor Hayes Briggs said, "I believe you did." She took her hand back. The provisional legal arrangement, when the Tennessee State Archaeologist and the Federal Treasury and the Knox County Attorney's Office had finished their slow, careful work 9 months later, would recognize the contents of the sealed chamber as a historically significant deposit with a documented intended beneficiary schedule, Silas Hayes's list of 47 names. The schedule would be honored as a matter of equitable consideration, with the state and federal shares reduced in recognition of the preservation and discovery. Descendants of the named families would be contacted, where they could be traced, including in particular descendants of Abraham Green and Peter Coates, who were traced in Nashville and in Memphis, and who received the largest of the distributions, as Silas had asked. Eleanor Hayes Briggs, as the direct lineal descendant of Captain Silas Hayes, received a finder's share and a separate share in the name of the Briggs family. Jax Harlan, as the legal owner of the land and the man who had recovered the deposit, received a finder's share as well, smaller than Eleanor's but sufficient to rebuild a cabin and to never again sleep in a truck, and to keep a good dog in good food for the rest of a good dog's life. None of them became rich in the way the Briar Hollow feed store counted rich. All of them became, in a different and older sense of the word, kept. Spring came late that year to the hollow, but when it came all at once. The rebuilt cabin sat square to the rising sun on the same stone foundation. New cedar shakes on the roof, a wider porch, a small garden fenced against deer, smoke rising thin and blue from the repaired chimney at dawn. A mile down the county road, on the same ground her husband's father had built on in 1947. Eleanor Hayes Briggs's new house sat with a wider porch of its own and a rocking chair on it that had not rocked empty in 3 months. Up the slope from Jax's cabin, the mine entrance had been fitted with a proper steel door. Behind the door, in the first chamber, a small plain wooden sign had been mounted on the limestone wall. It read, in careful hand-lettered black paint, "In memory of Captain Silas W. Hayes, of the 3rd Tennessee, pressed into gray and loyal under it. In memory of Abraham Green and of Peter Coates, teamsters, freedmen, who carried the load. In memory of Corporal Benton J. Briggs, Vietnam husband, they kept faith when faith was costly. We who came after are in their debt." A warm April evening. Jax on the porch in a clean chambray shirt, coffee in hand, Smoky at his feet, chin on his left boot, amber eyes half closed. Eleanor walking slowly up the rutted track that was no longer rutted, carrying a tin plate of cornbread covered with a red and white checkered dish towel. She climbed the new porch steps. She set the plate on the rail. She sat in the second rocking chair without asking, and looked out over the hollow. "Quiet evening," she said. "Yes, ma'am." A long silence. Smoky sighed once, deep, and shifted her chin more squarely onto Jax's boot. Eleanor watched the dog. She said without looking at him, "A man who does right by a widow does right by the world." Jax did not answer. He did not need to. The light on the ridge went soft and gold. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.